something happened just outside of my community in Vancouver, BC, that changed my life. And that was a young girl by the name of Amanda. She was 17 years old. She died by suicide that spring. And I didn't know her, I didn't know her friends, I didn't know her family, but it was the first person in my whole life that I had ever heard of who was a teenager who had died by suicide. And it was so deeply ironic because I had struggled with it. I knew what it was like to be there in a moment like that, but I'd never heard of that happening. And her story got this huge international media attention. And I assumed that that was because it was so uncommon, right? That this never happens. And I realized that it was the exact opposite of that, that suicide in this country for people under 25 like myself is the #1 leading cause of death. And that globally last year we had about 1 million suicides in the world. And I learned this and felt this sense of shock because this problem is so well documented on one hand, but it's so poorly discussed. And I went to my counselor and I just had this feeling in my heart that like I had to do something. And I showed up and I was so upset that this girl's story had been such a media piece of attention for a week. And after that, it was gone. And this girl who had died at 17 years old by suicide, nobody was talking about it anymore. It's like nobody remembered her name. And I went to him and I told him all these things. And for 30 minutes, I just kind of ranted and rambled to him. At the end of it, he looks at me and he goes, maybe if you want to make a change, you should start with yourself. And I had no idea what that meant, right? Because at the time, I'm a teenage kid trying to make it doing stand-up comedy in the mecca of show business, which is Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, where there's one comedy club, and it's called Hecklers. What? And there was an open mic that I was going to called the Ratfish Open Mic that was in a beat-down Ramada Inn in Esquimalt, where like if you went to Victoria and you opened up Google Maps and you typed in like, where do I buy drugs? Like that's what would come up, you know? And you would like go down this hallway into this tiny room and it's like this small little tiny theater that fits 15 people and there's like some bourbon and some broken dreams, you know what I mean? Like that kind of vibe. And it's like 12 dudes wearing tap-out t-shirts with like chain link tattoos on their biceps and they're like, you have 2 minutes, make them laugh, kid. So that's where my career was at, and it was hard to deal with the success. You know what I mean? I'm not going to lie to you. Luckily, I have a spiritual framework, so I was okay. But point being, when my counselor said, hey, you should share your story about being depressed and suicidal, I was like, I don't think so. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's the worst idea you've ever had. I think you suggest something like that as a counselor and repo men should come in. You know what I mean? Like, just taking degrees off the wall. Like, that made no sense to me, but this thought grew in my mind of why am I so scared to share this story? Why am I so scared to talk about it? And the only thing I could think of was that maybe in some way I was embarrassed. I felt this sense of shame. And people talk about the stigma of mental health all the time. And I think that's what they mean, you know? And I just had this thought where I went, I need to do it just for myself, just totally selfishly. I need to be able to own my own story and not hide from it and not run from it and not be embarrassed. And so I made this commitment that if I got the opportunity, I was going to do that. I was going to share my story. And my counselor said something so interesting to me, and he said, all of us just get 2 choices with our lives. He goes, we can either share them or we can be ashamed of them. That's it. And he goes, and for the last 4 years, you've been ashamed of your story and who you are. So what would it look like to share it? And I just couldn't get that out of my head, you know? And just by coincidence, I got this email a few weeks later from a family friend who was putting on a TEDx event. And they're like, hey, it's a TEDx youth event. We're wondering if you'd have anything you'd like to talk about. And I was like, okay, I'm going to take this as divine timing, you know? And so I prepared this talk. It was 10 minutes long. And I was like, I only have 2 goals. One's the selfish goal, just to own my own story and feel comfortable. But the other goal is unselfish. And I hope that there's one person in the room in a point in their life, like I was at 17, or Amanda was at 17, who could use my story, not as some sort of huge inspiration or life-changing moment, but just as a mirror. Just to be able to see themselves in and reflect back and go, hey, I get that. And so I show up at this event, and it's this TEDx event in East Vancouver, and I walk into the green room, and they open the door, and there's just literally 15 children in the room, like small humans, you know the ones. And I'm like, oh, like, are these like the speakers' kids? And they're like, no, these are just the speakers. All right. And so there's this kid, literally I follow a child, a 9-year-old wearing a 3-piece suit, talking about the future of gold prices with a PowerPoint, okay? Like, he's 9, he can't manage your portfolio. Do you understand that? Like, he doesn't understand proper asset allocation. Like, his mom makes all his food. Do you know what I'm getting at? Like, it wasn't right. And so I follow this kid, I go on, I give this talk, it's 10 minutes long. It's a little bit awkward, a little bit painful, but I get through it. People are very kind. I leave. 4 weeks later, I get this email from TED, and they say, hey, we're going to put your talk online. And I'm like, oh, that's awesome, because 5 people will watch this. You know what I mean? 4 of them will be related to me. And it's like your Aunt Penny being like, you go, girl. And you're like, well, I'm a grown man. So it hurts. And this talk came online, and I literally had no expectations of it whatsoever. And in the first 30 days, 1 million people had seen it. And that didn't really mean anything, to be honest, because it was just this tiny number on a screen going up. What does that mean? Here we are all in a room together. I can look you in the eyes. It feels very real. A number just getting bigger slowly on a screen really didn't mean anything to me. And then I started to get letters, handwritten letters from people. And I got 10,000 over the next month. And I spent time to go through and read each one. And the thing that I took the most from that was that every single letter and card that I got was basically the same story. Hey, I struggle with this and I don't know how to talk about it. Hey, I have a friend or a partner or someone I care about who struggles and I don't know how to help them. I don't know what to do. Hey, we lost someone that we love to suicide and we want to change this conversation. And I realized that this buzzword of mental health, this thing that's such a broad, vague word that means something different to you and to you and to you, really isn't about being a man or being a woman or being young or being old or being black or being white. It's about being a human being. And what do you do when things get tough? Who do you go to? How do you have those conversations? Because they matter. They're important.